Hey, let's take a quick time out for some great news. Open enrollment is here. DigitalWorks Pro is offering a series of courses on model-based systems engineering. First up, an introduction to MBSE. This short course is designed for executives, managers, and senior leaders who want to know more about model-based systems engineering. The course explains what MBSE is, why it matters, and how it can improve the scope of projects, from cost to schedule to quality. You will be more than ready to support your organization when it inevitably adopts MBSE. Again, enrollment is open right now. To make sure you have a seat, scan the QR code on your screen or go to the link at our website, digitalworks.org. To make sure there's a spot for you, register and do it now. Hello everyone, I'm Steve Johnson. Welcome to DigitalWorks TV. We have a treat for you today. Ralph Petroff. Gosh, Ralph, there's so much to say about you. I don't even know where to start. But let me say that you started out with an environmental services company in Huntsville. Did that for what, 30 years or 20 years?
20 years, yeah.
Then you had a company, a wireless company, and then you were involved with a company, a defense company. And you are not an engineer, but you told me you're a historian, a political scientist, and a businessman. And you've been quite successful in all the companies you worked with. And though they weren't always owned locally, you and members of your family worked for all of them. Am I correct?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. Your dad, which kind of leads us into what we're going to talk about, your dad, Peter, worked with von Braun during the I guess, did he work with him during the Army days before he got?
No, he was
Okay.
actually a late joiner. He didn't join until about 1966. Prior to that, he was working for a variety of aerospace companies since his arrival in Melbourne, Florida in 1959.
Okay. Your dad was, by the way, from Bulgaria.
He was from Bulgaria, and he fought, I counted it up, on under seven different flags in World War II.
Yeah.
He spoke 7 languages, but after World War II, all the war refugees wanted to get to the U.S., but there was no immigration from the eastern part of Europe. And instead, a lot of people went to Canada or Australia.
Yeah.
So I was born in Canada, but before I was out of diapers, we moved to Saigon, as one does.
That could be a whole other interview, and you said that a while ago, huh?
When it was still the Paris of the Orient, and then my dad got his, after Sputnik, I'm only here because of Sputnik, because after Sputnik...
Let's get ahead. Don't get ahead of ourselves. Okay, so we're talking. You're not an engineer, but you have been involved with engineers. You have a brother who's an engineer who has been part of the companies that you worked with. But you were very well acquainted with the German rocket team, and their families. Who it's not outlandish to say that without the German rocket team moving here in 1949 and 50. This would not be the rocket city, and Lord knows where we would have built rockets to be the first on the moon. So we're talking about the Germans. All right, so let's go. Your dad and your dad has a great connection. The Germans moved here in 1950, working for the Army.
Yes, that's right. And you ask a very good question. What would have happened if they never moved here? Like on that wonderful Jimmy Stewart movie, It's a Wonderful Life, if he was never born. Well, Huntsville was a town of 13,000 people in 1950. And had the Germans not arrived, I think we would be maybe a town of 24,000 people, hoping to catch up to Anniston, Decatur sometime in our lifetimes.
And really, this was a city with cotton. There were cotton farms and textile mills. That's what it was about.
That was it. And the Redstone Arsenal, which had 20,000 people working at it in 1948, the war is over. It shuts down. They're desperate for new business. They put in a big proposal with high hopes to get it filled again, and they fail because that project, the Arnold Air Force Wind Tunnel, ends up going to Tullahoma. Yeah. But they've made a good impression on the Army, so the city of Huntsville rolls the dice again, and they get the consolation prize of these German rocket scientists who arrived here 75 years ago. And so on Montesano, we've been having celebrations of the 75th arrival, and I spoke at a couple of venues here about the lasting impact of the Von Braun team.
And gosh, I mean, if we start, they arrive here, and I've heard stories when Axel Roth, a friend of mine, whose dad was one of the original German rocket team, he told me, he said, we drove and we stopped and spent the night on the way on the side of the road, slept in the car. And I mean, and they came from Fort Bliss, and they had been working at White Sands Missile Range, launching V2s while we kind of learned what we could from their expertise about their rocket. Am I telling that right?
Yes, you are. And so, I always try and put myself in the shoes of what it must have been like to be there. So let's circle back to World War II. So they are getting bombed nightly, and German per capita casualties were 30 times those of the United States, 30 times more Germans lost, and maybe like 80 times more Poles and Ukrainians. And so you have been in the hell of war. Everybody you know has lost family members. You probably have too, direct family. And then all of a sudden you're plucked out of hell and you're put into purgatory. 5 years of wandering around in the deserts of Fort Bliss. And then you stumble into paradise, the Eden of Alabama, North Alabama and Montesano, where they all lived, either on the top or on the slopes. And you've been given a second chance. And like so many other groups that came from all around the world to America, it's like, we want to build a wonderful society. So in the Bible, they talk about beating your swords into plowshares. They did one better. They beat their swords into spaceships.
Okay, so we need to mention very quickly, there was Operation Paperclip,
yes,
which brought the German scientists. They surrendered, not all of them, but von Braun's brother Magnus, Werner von Braun's brother Magnus, surrendered to the Allies, and Operation Paperclip with a man, a colonel at the time, Holger Toftoy.
Yes.
So kind of. And engineered them getting them to Fort Bliss, and they didn't all come at the same time, and they all didn't come the same way, but they ended up at Fort Bliss. And I don't think you could call them prisoners, but they were semi-prisoners at Fort Bliss for a while. Am I correct about that?
Yes, they were confined to military barracks, as my neighbor Ernst Stuhlinger said. We were POP. So what does that stand for? Prisoners of peace.
And they lived there, and then at some point they decided they needed a facility to develop America's missile program, the ballistic missile program.
That's exactly right. And Cold War tensions were running high on the Korean Peninsula. It broke out to war, so they decided to take these folks who had been basically kept on ice, just sort of piddling around, and start throwing some serious resources at them. And
so they end up, and I've heard the story about, and I forget who it was. It was Toftoy, I think, crawling around on a big map of the U.S. and pointing out to Assistant Secretary of the Army or Defense or something about Redstone Arsenal. This is where we could go. And then there was the influence of John Spartman, Senator John Spartman. So there were a lot of things came together to bring the German rocket team here.
Yes, and it all ended up clicking. And then one of their first jobs, now think about this, one of their very first jobs was to go and hire a bunch of engineers in May and June 75 years ago, 1950. Who were these engineers? They were the very first GI Bill war graduating class. So many of them, when we did these oral interviews for a couple of things out at the Space Center 15, 20 years ago for the Explorer 1 anniversary, 50th anniversary of America in space, they all told the same story. Why did you decide to become an engineer? He said, because I grew up picking cotton for a penny a pound in the Great Depression, and I never wanted to pick another bowl of cotton again in my life, and I never thought I would have the opportunity to go to college. So these guys took it seriously. And then all of a sudden, they find themselves sitting across the table from their former adversaries, but now the tables are turned.
Yeah.
They're going to be working for these bosses, for the guys they defeated.
And you say that, and it's interesting because I was privileged to get to know a couple of the original engineers who worked out at the Arsenal, who had served in World War II, and one in particular, Alex McCool. He loved the Germans. And he said everybody did. He said because and I said, well, why? He said because they worked with you. They didn't tell you what to do. They worked with you, and they were already from the very beginning doing important things.
Yes, I know. And these are men who had been given a second chance. And they said, we just like those country boys picking cotton, growing up without electricity or running water. It's like, my God, we've survived the war. We're going to college. We're going to do something that's never been done before.
And of course, first thing they did was get America in the ballistic missile business, and the most famous example of that is the Redstone missile, which was pretty special, and it will get more special as time goes on. But it was our first serious deployable, and I think it's nuclear capable ballistic missile developed at Redstone Arsenal.
Yes, and it's like all the other rockets they built. It was completely functional, reliable. Von Braun. I just saw the other day a comment of his. He didn't like calling the Saturn V a moon rocket. He says it is a space rocket because it can go to a lot of other places other than just the moon.
That's pretty interesting. Okay, so the Germans are here. They're working on missiles, but somebody was thinking about space, and that would have been the main guy.
Basically, all of them. Von Braun, he was obsessed with space. When he was 14 or 15, he tells his folks, I've decided I want to make my life's mission to open the gates of heaven. And now this was fueled even more by the famous German director Fritz Lang, who's known for Metropolis with the woman robot. Anyway, Fritz Lang makes the first realistic moon movie, Die Frau im Mond, The Woman in the Moon, about a woman astronaut. And so it was sort of like the Star Wars of its time.
Yeah.
So all these young German rocket nerds, because they were all teenagers in 1930, they saw this movie and like, yes, we can do it. And they even had, in the movie, this sequence, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, then liftoff. And they said, if we ever get to build real rockets, we're going to have a liftoff just like in the movie.
Wow. It just occurs to me that we at least need to allude to the fact that these Germans worked on the V2 program and launched missiles that hit England. And I mean, they were weapons of war. They worked on that for for a pretty horrible regime.
Yeah.
So they did have that in their past. Ernst Stuhlinger is one of the original German that I ever talked to, and I always had trouble putting him together with that. But he also told me that had he not been called back from the Russian front by von Braun, he wouldn't have survived because his entire unit died.
Yes.
So, and you've talked to, has that? It's stupid to ask if that's come up in conversation, but did they, in their minds, reconcile what they had done for Nazi Germany?
I think they reconcile. I'll put it to you this way. One of the best quotes I heard was from an 8th Air Force bomber pilot who said, I killed more people over Hamburg in 15 minutes than all the V2s. And I think they all said, even the harshest of von Braun critics, Michael Neufeld, said that the V2 was largely an ineffective weapon. He said that to drop a 1-ton payload, the cost was 500,000 times or some big number like that, more than the
and you couldn't really aim it. It was a big parabola. And
yes, but in terms of its psychological effect, yes, Churchill, that was the thing that
it was considered a terror weapon.
Yes, a terror weapon. But when you're on the receiving end, all weapons are terrible.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
You know, my parents were both imprisoned by the Nazis over the years for various things. So, you know, I'm not one of these guys who has any special love for Nazis, I'll put it that way, but you know, they never held anything against the Germans any more than they did against the Americans who bombed them. You know, it was just, it was war, and that's what happened.
I just felt like we needed to mention
yes,
that.
yes,
But when they got here, not only were they working for America to develop missiles, and let's talk about the next thing. Well, how did they go from missiles? Very quickly, how they went from missiles to actually being the first part of our space program.
Yes, well, you have to go back to 1956, the International Geophysical Year.
Yeah.
Now, keep in mind that for the previous 26 years, since 1930, the von Braun team, dreaming of space travel, had worked exclusively on military rockets.
Yeah.
So they get their big chance, which is a proposal to put a satellite in orbit for the first International Geophysical Year.
Yeah.
And so they're like, Coach, give me the ball. But they put a brilliant proposal together, but they are told no, and the project goes to the Navy primarily because the Army didn't want their A-team to be working on a little science experiment instead of focusing on weapons of mass destruction. So it went to the Vanguard, and then, of course, on October the 7th, 1957, Sputnik gets launched, and then you see all of a sudden this worldwide shock. One of your guests, Homer Hickam, has a wonderful comment. He said that when he looked in the West Virginia sky over Coldwood and saw Sputnik, he said, I could not have been more impressed if it was God himself and his golden chariot.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, watching news reports on like CBS and reading the major newspapers, not only was America shocked, people were scared. They're up above us, and we don't know what they're doing. Turns out Sputnik didn't do anything but beep.
But we didn't know that. What kind of death ray is lurking there? Edward Teller, the father of the H-bomb, said, you thought Pearl Harbor was bad? This is twice as bad. Yeah. So it set off a global panic. And, of course, the global applause meter, which was, the United States are very forward-thinking and the Russians are not. All of a sudden, the non-aligned nations started looking at this and saying, wait a minute, it looks like maybe communism is the wave of the future.
Yeah, in fact, a lot of things have been done that turned out pretty cool were done for propaganda reasons, to show they can't get ahead of us technologically. And that kind of was what Sputnik, our answer to Sputnik was Explorer.
Yes, and Explorer was, again, the Russians had all these successes, and then von Braun says, Coach, give us the ball. We can have something up in 90 days. And 86, 87 days later, they did it. And when you talk to Ernst Stuhlinger, he said, this was really like, he says, one of those old Mickey Rooney and Judy Garland movies where they say, let's put on a play in the garage, and then everybody runs around and it's,
It is amazing what they did. Okay, so we answered with Sputnik. In 1958, NASA was created because we had to have, if we're going to be in space, we had to have an agency, had to have something, because the idea, which was a great idea, was to not be military with our space efforts. And so NASA's created, and you're thinking, well, how could they create NASA and not have these guys who put a satellite into orbit as part of it? Well, they didn't, did they? It didn't last very long.
No, because the Army was like, "Ooh, these are our golden boys. We're not going to let them go somewhere else. This is a great thing." You could totally understand that, but that is one of the reasons why Huntsville would have been the logical people to run everything. But by the time the Army and NASA worked it out in 1960, that window is passed. But Huntsville, the toughest part of getting to the moon is, actually getting to the moon, and that is the Saturn V. And if you think about, no one's gone to the moon in over 50 years.
Yeah.
And it's not because technology hasn't advanced. It's quantum, and quantum leaps ahead. But building a super ultra reliable rocket is not as easy as it looks.
And that is what the German rocket team, leading a large group of engineers, did with the Saturn V. So we don't want to ever pretend that it was just the German rocket team, but they were the ones, they had the expertise to lead an overall effort to build a moon rocket.
Whenever Dr. von Braun would get complimented in public, oh, the great German rocket team, he would say, no, 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 no. We've had 12 years of more mistakes than our American counterparts. And so we're passing on all the mistakes we've made. So it was a team. I don't know in technology history how, if there were ever two more divergent groups of people that were so beautifully in sync with each other.
And I think that's borne out by the fact that I have had more than one veteran of the Saturn V days tell me, we worked 6-day weeks a lot. And he said, we didn't care. We could not wait to go to work.
Know.
And I had more than one person tell me that. We couldn't wait to go to work because we were doing something special. Now, that was, of course, the moon program. But, so Marshall was created in 1960. Basically, all the Army folks, the Army Ballistic Missile Agency, walked out, had a ceremony, turned around. Half of them stayed with the Army.
Yeah.
The rest of them, plus a lot of buildings and gear, went with NASA, went with Marshall Space Flight Center. And then they set about building a rocket, which got a date laid on it by a president. So, which to me, it's one thing to say we're going to build a moon rocket. It's another one for a guy to say we're going to build a moon rocket. We're going to put people on the moon within the decade, as Kennedy said.
Yes, exactly. And to me, this is one of the most remarkable parts of the story. Kennedy hasn't even finished his first 100 days in office, and he's got this double whammy. Yuri Gagarin goes up in space, first man in space. Again, the world applause-o-meter goes to the Russians. And then not even a week later, the Bay of Pigs blows up in his face. So he is tanking in the polls. And he dispatches Lyndon Johnson. He says, talk to Americans about prominent Americans about how we can restore prestige. And I can just see Von Braun. He gets one of those letters, and like Mr. Burns on Simpsons going, excellent, because now he has got a chance to, and he writes this beautiful memo, I think it's April 25th of 61, talking about we have a sporting chance of getting to the to the moon by the end of the decade. He gave it about 70% chance. And he said it will cost this much. And of course, it came in just a smidgen under budget. Under time, under budget, for 1,000 to 1 odds against it. Not bad.
Yeah, that's right. That's the London bookies, who apparently post odds on everything. What did you tell me the odds were of going to the moon within a decade?
I had misread it. I had years ago. I read about this, that it happened in 1961, but there were no odds in 1961. The first official record of an odd was in April of 1964, 3 years after Kennedy, and then it was set at 1,000 to 1.
So, but when Kennedy made the promise, I mean, he had intel from von Braun that yes, we can do it, but still, that's going out on a pretty big limb to promise we're going to the moon. And isn't it? And not only that, but until the moon program, it's not a stretch to say that the Russians, they beat us in every way possible with spaceflight. They had the first of everything. Am I right about that?
You are right about that. And just to give you an idea, the odds on January 1st for a moon landing had become had dropped. But the odds of the Soviets making it there before the Americans were still much more favorable than the Americans made it.
Okay, but what was it about? And you've talked to these men and women. What was it about the German leadership? And that is certainly the way to describe it. That made the effort proceed. I'm sure it didn't seem as smoothly at the time, but it's from looking at it from now. It's like they decided to build a rocket and they did it. But what was it about the folks who had the initial expertise leading the effort that made it work in your mind?
Well, I think it gets to something I call doing things the Apollo way.
Yeah.
And so the Apollo way really consists of three things. Number one, a crystal clear mission statement. Yeah. As von Braun would joke, he says, yeah, everyone knows the difference between a live astronaut and a dead one.
Yeah.
And then second, put aside your differences and work on this common goal. So here we had former enemies who were trying to kill each other. Now they're in this wonderful work dynamic you described. And then the third thing, which is overlooked, is that publicize your mistakes internally and reward people for admitting mistakes.
Yeah. Am I correct that they, and I've been told this more than once, that they had regular meetings, big meetings, and where they brought the engineers and technicians together with the leadership, von Braun and Stuhlinger and all the leadership. And if you had a concern, you better, by gosh, raise your hand and say it, and they would figure out what the problem was. There wasn't any of, no, I'm not going to say anything because they'll get upset. They wanted to know.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, von Braun, when one guy admitted a mistake, he was so pleased with him, he gave him a fancy bottle of French champagne and made sure everybody knew about it. Now, when Elon Musk's Starship blows up and he asked people, why did it blow up? I don't think people are saying, oh, it was me. You know, they're all like, well, it might have been this department or that department.
Isn't that true? A guy told me one time, he said, we blew up stuff all the time. We had a different attitude about testing maybe then than we have now. Now if you test and it fails, we've wasted our money. These guys can't get it done. This is a terrible program. But then it was like that was the way to success.
Well, this is one of von Braun's mantras. We will never get to the moon if we do not admit our mistakes. Yeah. And that is a very powerful thing. And this is another aspect of this. So many of the people in the Apollo program did their own startups. And guess what? They internalized von Braun's management style. Very open, crystal clear goals. Everybody works together. Admit your mistakes. And it's deep in Huntsville's DNA. Yeah. As is, these guys literally pulled off a moonshot. Yeah. And so all the entrepreneurs, if you think back to Jim Medlock and Intergraph, or John Hendricks and Discovery Channel, or Jimmy Wales and Wikipedia, and Mark Smith and the modems, the first all these people were saying, well, yeah, it's probably 100-to-1 odds against success, but it's not as hard as putting the man on the moon, and we've done that.
We've done that. Something I want to make sure about. Sometime during the moon effort, there was something else that happened. The Germans became American citizens.
Yes.
And that was a big deal.
Oh, it was, because I can tell you this, as the children of Polish and Bulgarian war refugees, when you go to a country like America that welcomes you, and all of a sudden you have these freedoms, you don't have the secret police knocking on the door in the middle of the night and people grabbing you off the streets. So, that goes away, and they're so welcoming. My dad said, if he was Bulgarian, educated in German universities. He says, if I had stayed in German universities, I would have been, maybe 4 generations later, my kids might have been accepted in society. Yeah. I saw a wonderful clip of Ronald Reagan the other day. Said he was talking about that, if somebody from Germany comes to America, they become American, and French and this. He says, but if you go to Germany, you don't become German. If you go to France, you don't become French. It's just this unique special sauce of America and the melting pot and everybody working together and creating a new identity. So no one loves America like a war refugee, whether they're from Germany or Vietnam or Iran or Central America, Cuba, it doesn't matter. They just look up as this beacon. They're the most idealistic of Americans.
From the your conversations with the Germans, like Dr. Stuhlinger. Did they know at a certain point, yeah, we're going to do it? Did he ever? Were they did they know from the get-go they were going to do it? I mean, I know from stories I've done or interviews that there were some issues that they had to overcome, things they didn't even understand about this monster rocket they were building. But when did they know, or when did they start thinking, yeah, this is going to happen?
Well, I think they thought they could do it all the time from the get-go, but they knew how hard it was. I Googled what were the odds in 1961, and the ChatGPT told me there were no odds in 1961 because the probability would have been essentially zero.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, you're starting from nothing.
From nothing, and I have a copy of that wonderful Rice University speech of John Kennedy, where he says, "We do these things not because they are easy, but because they are hard." Yeah. And he talks about describing the mission, how hard it is a mission to an unknown celestial body with an untried technology, with technology that hasn't even been invented yet. And he ticks this off, and you listen to this, and you go, my gosh, this is going to be hard. But, after Apollo 8, right about Christmas time in 67, I think it was, or maybe 68, all of a sudden it's like, this.
And that's when the American people, and that's the mission where they read passages out of the Bible.
I think
but the American people were enthralled by this, which it became a national effort.
Absolutely, and there are probably 100 different nationalities that worked on that program. Yeah. It was a thing that could bring us together, especially at such a divisive time in the 60s when you have a president getting killed, and then Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King, and then all the cultural changes and the Vietnam protests. This is the one thing that could bring Americans together and show that nothing is impossible if you put your mind to it.
And as Von Braun said, former adversaries working together.
That was a critical thing. And I asked Dr. Stuhlinger, this tells you something about human nature. I asked Dr. Stuhlinger, I said, how much tension was there? And he says, much less than I expected. It wasn't zero tension. There were some people that, on both sides, one of my colleagues who had lost his family in a bombing raid, another fellow lost his brother at Omaha Beach, what have you. And then I said, well, Doc, I got to ask this question. When you went to Europe for those post-war aerospace conferences, did you ever see your Soviet colleagues? And he says, oh, yes. And I said, what about the conflict there? And just so everybody understands, for every dead German American GI, there were 10 German GI equivalents and 100 Russians. So they lost a staggering amount of men. And I said, what was the tension like with the Russians? And he said, would you believe it? It was even less. And I said, how is that possible? And he says, the loss was greater. Let me give you an example. I meet my Soviet counterpart 1955 or something at a conference in Vienna. And you go to the bar and you drink and you socialize. And the question is, the icebreaker question is, what did you do in the war? And Von Braun and Stuhlinger says, well, I fought at Stalingrad. And he said, I did too. And Ernst said, and I lost my brother at Stalingrad. And the Soviet said, I lost 5 brothers at Stalingrad. And he says, at that point, we burst into tears, embraced each other, and he says, we corresponded regularly until his death a year ago. So that shows you something about the human nature that to me is just remarkably ennobling.
Well, the German rocket team leading the effort. So when we actually get to the moon, we know how the world reacted. How did, from your conversations, how did these men and their families who lived in Germany during World War II came here, were part of an effort first to develop ballistic missiles and then to put a man on the moon? How did they react? How did they feel about their effort, which was the most the largest engineering effort in the world. I think it's safe to say that. How did they feel about it?
Well, just put yourself in your shoes. In 1929, you've been toying with rockets through the late 1920s. You're a rocket nerd. You see this movie and say, one day we're going to go to space travel. But then, for the next 30 years, from 1930 to 1960, you're working on basically weapons of mass destruction. 15 years for each side. And then you finally get your chance. And then, 1969, so what is that, 1930? So you have been going at this for 40 years, and finally you realize this impossible dream. It was just absolute elation, and they were always, and then the plan, of course, was to get to Mars before 1980.
Yeah. I know that as the Saturn V, when we landed on the moon, they had been for a couple of years laying off engineers and technicians at Marshall Space Flight Center because it's a development center, and there wasn't the next project wasn't really there yet. Was the same thing happening to the Germans? Were they also falling by the wayside like their American engineering counterparts?
No, they were all there, and they were just dreaming of all the glorious thing they would do in the future, and then the last 3 or 4 Apollo missions get canceled, and then in one fell swoop, a new director comes in and says, "Okay, these Germans are all at retiring age," and they basically all of them were forced into retirement. And so from this, elation of accomplishing these things and saying, next stop Mars, all of a sudden, kaboom. Yeah. They've got to jumpstart their careers. So it was very hard on them.
Oh, I can imagine. And von Braun himself was, it's common now to say he was kicked upstairs. He was taken away from his center where the Saturn V was developed and sent to headquarters. And am I right that he ended up doing something where he was involved with education, that he had presented a plan to go to Mars, but that nothing ever really happened with that?
Yes, and it was just my father, I was reading Bob Ward's wonderful book, Dr. Space, and one of the chapter headings is his time in Washington after the moon landing. And my father likened it to a Greek tragedy. Yeah. He says, where this one human being is given all these immense talent. He was charming, a great manager, a brilliant engineer, and all the lesser gods have all these jealousies, and they keep throwing all these hindrances in his way. And I think that's what happened.
Well, and von Braun, from what I've heard, what I've read and heard from other people, there was there were plenty of people at headquarters at NASA and government, whatever, who did not like the fact that von Braun and even the other German rocket team members were getting all this acclaim for getting us to the moon.
Just, petty jealousy. It's you have all these star performers, and I remember Ed Buckby, who was was von Braun's public affairs officer, and then of course over at the Space and Rocket Center, he was the guiding visionary over there. Or he would say it was von Braun, but he did the nuts and bolts, astronaut Hall of Fame, board member, and all this. And he said, I saw this dynamic so closely. You would have all these big shots there, on a panel, NASA bigwigs, and then von Braun was technically, several levels down. And so, any questions from the audience? And 100% of the questions went to von Braun. He would sit there sort of red-faced and said, well, let me defer to... Yeah. But so there was a lot of professional jealousy, which happens in organizations.
Oh, yeah, by the way, we need to mention that von Braun kind of, this is the wrong way to describe it, but cooked the books to get the parts of the Saturn V that some of the incredible things that are at the Space and Rocket Center now, he got them.
Yes.
He said, we're going to use it to test. Well, no, not really, but it ended up at the Space and Rocket Center.
Yeah, well, he was full of mischief in a good way. Yeah. He was not a boring person. This is a guy who age 3 could read books and was writing symphonies, Mozart level prodigy.
That's right. He could play music. He could write music.
And he was, John Glenn in the foreword of Dr. Space writes, he always likes looking at people's libraries because it reveals a lot about them. And he said he went into von Braun's personal laboratory, personal library. His first meeting, von Braun invites the Gemini 7 astronauts up to his house, and he's looking at all the books, expecting them to be math and physics and space. And he said there was comparative religion, there was Hindu philosophy, and he said it reflected a man of just a very wide range of interest.
At the very least, von Braun was a managerial genius. I've heard stories about that. It was not unusual for a technician to say, "Hey, buddy, can you hand me that wrench?" And von Braun would hand him the wrench because he was out there checking out everything, trying to get his arms around everything.
Everything, and he had the tremendous insight to know that a leader should not be behind a desk. A leader should be out in the field, either in the business world, I say, my mantra was I should spend 20% of my time out behind my desk, 40% with customers, 40% with coworkers. And von Braun, I don't know how he managed to accomplish it with so many people. It was hard enough at companies with hundreds of people.
Yeah. Well, and I want to say something about the German rocket team and their families. There are things in Huntsville that a town of its size, it's certainly larger now, largest town in Alabama, but it wasn't then. But it had a symphony orchestra, had a thriving art scene. It had an art museum, or it gained an art museum, gained a symphony orchestra. But these were things that, had the German rocket teams not come, might have ended up in Huntsville, but not for a long time.
No, not at all. And again, they're in this sense, they're like the pilgrims. You come to this new place, and everybody has these dreams of building a utopian society. I would argue that the von Braun team was the only successful, or the most successful utopians, because they said, let's take this little town and give it art and culture, and who knows, in 75 years it might be the biggest city in the state, it might be the most educated city in America, and it might be consistently voted the best place in America to live. I mean, there's a reason why Huntsville was the first city in Alabama to desegregate before the Civil Rights Act. And they did it voluntarily, and that was just a culture of adversaries putting aside their differences, which were considerable. Yeah. Especially, I wouldn't have given you 1,000-1 odds when I moved here from Cape Canaveral in the summer of 1963 that I would see African American folks vote in my lifetime. And 3 years later, they could, and 3 years after that, we're on the moon.
And very quickly. Wasn't just Sonny Morea who worked out at Marshall on the Saturn program. He has his firm belief that the Saturn V program, all the people who came here from all over the country, the German rocket team, helped change the whole attitude about civil rights, certainly in North Alabama, but really in the entire state of Alabama.
Yeah, I think so. And, I was talking... I'm also working with the group Rocket City Civil Rights that chronicles the remarkable history of the civil rights movement in Huntsville and how it was nonviolent and succeeded by essentially inventing social media before there was digital stuff. It is a fascinating story. In fact, I just found a PBS documentary on the American experience talking about Huntsville's desegregation efforts. So a part of it was you had these cosmopolitan influences already. And one of the, if you think back, Huntsville was not your ordinary town of 13,000 people because it had a little bit of cosmopolitan cachet. Tallulah Bankhead was born here. And so
We probably need to say who was a famous actress, mostly in theater, but she made some movies too. Yes.
And she was born in 1900.
Yeah.
At the Schiffman building.
Down on the square.
On the square. And she ends up being the toast of London and Broadway in the 1920s, and just a larger-than-life character. And so, the stories, of course, were always filled with Tallulah. And as the Huntsville biographer, Diane McWhorter, who's working on a massive compendium of Huntsville and the space program, has written, Huntsville was unique in the South in that the big man in town was a Jewish fellow, Lawrence Goldsmith, who was instrumental in coming down. So you had a bit of this, and Charles Younger, the attorney, the old city attorney, who's probably about 90 years old now, I asked him, were they just trying to keep the was the space program sort of being held for hostage if they didn't clean up their act? Was that a big driver? He says, yeah, it was a driver, but he said, Huntsville was just different. And I said, well, different how? He said, well, I had lived in Jackson and Birmingham and Tuscaloosa and all these cities. He says, Huntsville was just different.
Well, one thing that made it different, and I know you had the same experience when I was in elementary and middle school in Huntsville. Every kid I went to school with in South Huntsville, their dad worked for the Army or for NASA, every single one of them. So, and they were from all over the country. This has always been, still is, a town with deep Southern roots, but a population from all over the world.
And it's an ideal marriage, I think, because you have the. One of the things the Germans always commented on was the Southern hospitality, that folks here are nice people. So you combine the nice people with brilliant minds from all over the country and all over the world working on moonshots, whether it is in the space program or any one of these individual entrepreneurial activities. And it's a wonderful melting pot.
Okay, one last question. I want you to, if you would, and you obviously know a lot about this. You knew some of these people. If you were going to put it in perspective for us, the German rocket team, then their families, and let's never forget, their families still live in the area.
Yes.
And I would assume are quite proud of what their moms and dads did. Just put it in perspective. How should we think now about what those men and women did and their families by moving to a small North Alabama town known for cotton and textiles?
I mean, this is so appropriate a question. This is the 75th anniversary of the arrival of the Von Braun team. The last of the Von Braun team members, Doretta Schlitt, passed away 4 years ago. And I did the math. The very youngest of that GI War Bill class of 1950 would be 99 years old, if any of them are still alive. So, that generation has passed. And they gave us, I think, the most remarkable legacy of the 20th century. They pulled off the century's greatest achievement, the moon landing. That's the historical consensus. They did it with their former enemies. They pulled off an 1,000-to-1 moonshot, and they did it under time and under budget, and they created a city that's now the most livable city in America. So, I mean, they're all modest, and I don't think they think about it that way, but I think that's the way that we should be thinking about it, and most importantly, we should heed that lesson about working together. And I think if these German and American rocket scientists could speak to us from the grave, they would be telling us right now, we tried to kill each other in a war and we worked together to do important things. You people are all Americans. There is no problem that cannot be solved. If you follow the Apollo way, crystal clear mission, work together, admit your mistakes, and put your differences aside. And I think that really is their legacy, the greatest legacy of the 20th century, in my opinion.
All right, Ralph Petroff, thank you for being with us.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks for sharing all that. We'll have to talk more.
My pleasure.
And thank you for being with us, too. I'm Steve Johnson. Remember, this is Digital Works TV, and never forget, it works.